The wind was a thief. It stole the moisture from the air, the topsoil from the fields, and the hope from Alara's heart. It howled across the cracked expanse of what had once been the Blackwood Ranch, carrying nothing but dust and the scent of failure. From her porch, she watched the horizon, a mercilessly clear blue line that promised only more sun, more heat. The world had been bleached of its color, leaving behind shades of brown and brittle yellow. Her husband, Thomas, had seen promise in this land. He had spoken of deep roots and sweet water, of cattle fat on clover. Now, he was just a name carved into a wooden cross on a hill overlooking the dust, and the land was a debt made manifest. Inside the silent house, a letter lay on the table, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the decay surrounding it. The bank's seal was an indifferent eye staring up at her. Foreclosure. The word was a final, brutal judgment. 30 days. She had 30 days to produce a sum that was as fantastical as a river in this desert. Every morning, the weight of it settled on her before she even opened her eyes, a physical pressure in her chest that made each breath a conscious effort. She was a ghost in her own home, haunted by the memory of laughter and the phantom weight of Thomas's hand on her shoulder. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing, amplifying the creak of the floorboards and the relentless moan of the wind, filling the spaces where life used to be. Fear was a constant, cold companion, a knot in her stomach that never loosened. It was the fear of the unknown road, of a town that would offer pity but no help, of becoming another cautionary tale whispered over fence posts. The man who worked for her, Silas, was as quiet as the land was loud. He was the only soul left on the ranch, a remnant of a time when a dozen hands had worked the fields. He'd lost his own, spread 2 counties over to the same blight of drought and debt, and had appeared at her gate a year ago, his worldly possessions in a single canvas sack. He asked for nothing but work and a roof over his head in the old bunkhouse. He spoke little, his words chosen with the care of a man who knew their value. He moved with a deliberate economy, his lean frame wiry and tough, weathered like an old fence post that refused to fall. He did the work of 3 men, mending what could be mended, his presence a silent, steady counterpoint to her spiraling despair. This evening, as the sun bled out across the sky, he did not go to the bunkhouse. He stood before her on the porch, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. The dust had settled into the lines on his face, mapping years of hardship. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low rumble and used to carrying. She waited. He seemed to be wrestling with the words, a rare sign of disquiet in him. That dry creek bed, the one at the north edge of the property, the one they call Misfortune's Run, she knew it. A scar of bleached rock and gravel where water hadn't flowed in a generation. It was the most useless parcel of a useless ranch. "I'll buy it," he said. Alara stared at him, certain the heat had finally broken him. "Buy it?" she repeated, the words hollow. "It's nothing but stone," he nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were dark and serious. "I have savings. Not much. $100, he pulled a small, worn leather pouch from his pocket. It was a pathetic sum, an insult to the land's former worth, but to her now it was a lifeline. It was feed for the few remaining cattle. It was another week. "Why?" she asked, the question sharp with suspicion. "What use is a dry creek?" He looked away again, toward the gash of pale rock in the distance. "A man ought to have a piece of ground to his name," he said, and the simple finality in his tone left no room for argument. Even a worthless one. She saw the desperation in his offer mirroring her own. $100 for a pile of rocks. A fool's bargain on both sides. But the weight of the bank's letter pressed down, and she heard herself agree. The next morning, the transaction was completed with a crude, handwritten bill of sale. The town clerk, a man with watery eyes and a perpetually condescending smirk, had watched them with undisguised curiosity. The news spread as quickly as a prairie fire. Alara Blackwood, selling her land off for pennies. And to that strange, silent man who worked for her. The pity she had once received curdled into something sharper. Judgment. She was not just a victim of circumstance anymore. She was a fool, hastening her own demise. She tried to ignore the whispers when she went to town for supplies, the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store. She felt their eyes on her back, dissecting her worn dress, her tired face. Her grief had been a private, dignified burden. Now, her poverty was a public spectacle. From her porch, she watched Silas. He did not attempt to plow the creek bed or clear the stones for pasture. Instead, he arrived at dawn with a pickaxe and a shovel. He chose a spot near a bend in the dry run and began to dig. The rhythmic, metallic clang of the pick striking rock echoed in the vast silence. It was a maddening, relentless sound. Day after day, he toiled under the oppressive sun. His shirt soaked through with sweat, his movements methodical and unceasing. He was not digging a well. He was simply excavating, carving a shallow pit into the unyielding earth and rock. He built a small, crude dam of stone and packed earth just downstream from his pit, an act that made no sense where there was no water. She found herself watching him for hours, her mending forgotten in her lap. What was he searching for? Gold? The thought was absurd. This land had been surveyed a dozen times. It was good for grazing and nothing more. Was he mad? Had the grief of losing his own ranch unhinged him? Yet, there was no madness in his eyes. There was only a deep, unreadable purpose. A grim determination that seemed to burn away the very air around him. Her suspicion slowly gave way to a grudging curiosity. He was a puzzle, a man who had paid for the right to perform this backbreaking, nonsensical labor. He was gambling his last dollars and his physical strength on a secret he held close. And she, the owner of the crumbling world around him, was merely a spectator. The sky had been a hard, unforgiving blue for months, but one afternoon, it turned the color of a bruise. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, electric stillness. The wind died completely. The clouds gathered with an unnatural speed, a roiling mass of dark gray that swallowed the horizon. The first clap of thunder was not a distant rumble but a violent crack directly overhead, shaking the very foundations of the house. Then the rain came. It was not the gentle, life-giving rain she had prayed for. It was a deluge, a solid wall of water that hit the baked earth with the force of 1,000 tiny hammers. Within minutes, the ground could take no more, and the water began to move, turning the dusty ravines into churning brown torrents. A thought seized her, sharp and sudden. Silas, the creek bed. She ran to the window, peering through the sheets of rain. In the distance, she could just make out his silhouette, a dark shape against the gray fury. Misfortune's run, dry for a generation, was running again. A flash flood was tearing down the narrow channel, a roaring, debris-filled monster. It slammed into the small, crude dam he had built. He was fighting it, desperately piling rocks and mud against the breach, a lone man against the rage of the storm. He was going to be swept away. Something inside her broke. It was not pity. It was a fierce, protective instinct she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Without thinking, she pulled on her husband's old oilskin coat, grabbed a shovel from the barn, and ran out into the storm. The wind and rain tore at her, trying to drive her back. The mud sucked at her boots, but she pushed onward, her eyes fixed on the struggling figure. When she reached the creek, the roar was deafening. Silas saw her, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He shouted something lost to the wind. She didn't need to hear it. She saw the dam groaning, the water pouring over the top. She plunged in beside him, the cold, muddy water swirling around her knees, and began to dig, piling the heavy, wet earth onto the weakening wall. They worked in a frantic, silent rhythm, two desperate souls united against the indifferent violence of nature. They worked until their muscles screamed and the crest of the flood had passed, leaving the creek as a sullen, manageable flow. The dam, battered but intact, held. The rain softened to a persistent drizzle. Exhausted, caked in mud, they trudged back toward the house, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with the shared memory of the fight. Inside, the air was still and warm. Alara stoked the embers in the hearth, bringing a small fire to life. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, a welcome flicker of warmth against the gray gloom outside. She put a pot of coffee on to boil, the familiar aroma a small comfort. Silas stood by the door, dripping onto the floorboards, looking as though he might turn and leave. "Stay," she said, her voice raspy. "You'll catch your death," he hesitated, then gave a slow nod, moving to stand by the fire, his hands outstretched to the heat. She handed him a steaming mug, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. It was the first time they had ever touched. They drank in silence for a long time, the only sounds the hiss and crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. The storm had washed the world clean, and in its wake, the tension that had held them apart seemed to have dissolved. "You shouldn't have," he said finally, his voice low. He was looking into the flames, not at her. "It wasn't your fight. You would have been washed away," she replied simply. "That dam," he shook his head, a small, weary motion. "My own place. I built a dam twice that size. Thought I could beat the drought. When the rains finally came, it was like today. Too much, too fast. It broke. Took everything. The topsoil, the fences. Everything." He fell silent, but she could see it all in his haunted gaze. The ruin, the loss, the bitter taste of a dream turned to mud. In his story, she heard the echo of her own. He had lost his land to water. She was losing hers to dust. Two sides of the same cruel coin. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He met her eyes then, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic exterior to the profound grief he carried. There was no judgment in his look, only a shared, unspoken understanding. He had seen the bottom of the world, just as she was seeing it now. In that moment, he was no longer just her hired hand, the strange man digging for secrets. He was Silas, and she was no longer just his employer, the pitiable widow. She was Alara. The fire crackled, a small beacon in the vast, dark expanse of their loneliness. The brief respite brought by the storm was short-lived. A few days later, a buggy crested the rise, gleaming black against the washed-out landscape. Mr. Davies from the bank had come. He was a man built of sharp angles and starched collars, his face perpetually pinched in an expression of mild distaste, as if the entire world offended him with its lack of order. He stepped down from the buggy, carefully avoiding a patch of mud, his polished shoes an affront to the land itself. He did not come to the porch but stood in the yard, forcing Alara to come down to him, a small but deliberate assertion of power. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his tone devoid of any real sympathy. "A courtesy visit, to ensure you are making appropriate arrangements for your departure." His eyes scanned the property, lingering on the peeling paint of the barn and the broken fence line. His gaze was an inventory of her failure. "The deadline is firm." Just then, the rhythmic clang of pickaxe on stone started up again from the direction of the creek. Davies's head snapped toward the sound, a frown deepening the lines around his mouth. "What is that noise?" he demanded. "It's my hired hand. He's working," Alara said, her voice tight. Davies gave a short, derisive laugh. "Working at what?" "He appears to be digging a hole in a ditch." He turned his gaze back to her, a cruel glint in his eyes. "I heard in town you've taken to selling off parcels. Forgive me for being blunt, but selling a worthless rock pile for a pittance will not satisfy the bank. It only serves to confirm that you are not capable of managing this estate." Each word was a carefully aimed dart. He was not just a banker collecting a debt. He was a vulture, circling, enjoying the spectacle of her demise. He wanted to see her broken, her hand clenched at her side. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him of the storm, of the small victory against the flood. But she knew it would mean nothing to him. It would be just another sign of her sentimentality, her weakness. The sound of Silas's pickaxe continued, steady and defiant. It was the only answer to the banker's cold pronouncements. Davies seemed to find the sound personally insulting. "See that you are gone in 2 weeks' time, Mrs. Blackwood. The new owners will not wish to be inconvenienced." He climbed back into his buggy, leaving her standing in the yard, the dust settling around her, the weight of his words pressing down like a physical blow. The deadline was no longer a date on a calendar. It was a wall rushing toward her. The final day dawned with a terrible, beautiful clarity. The air was cool and clean, the sky a vast, empty blue. Felt like a mockery. Alara moved through the house in a daze, wrapping the few things she would take. Her mother's china, a photograph of her and Thomas, his worn leather-bound journal. Each object was a ghost, a tangible piece of a life that was about to be erased. The house was already hollow, its soul packed away into boxes. She looked out the window. Silas was still there, in the pit that was now waist-deep. He had not stopped, not even for a full night's rest. His movements were slower now, heavy with exhaustion, but they were no less determined. He looked smaller against the raw earth he had carved out, a solitary figure waging a war against time and rock. She couldn't bear to watch him fail. Taking a canteen of fresh, cool water from the well, she walked toward the creek bed. As she drew closer, the sound of the pickaxe changed. It was no longer a sharp, ringing clang. It was a dull, heavy thud, a sound of impact with something that wasn't stone. She stopped. He stood frozen for a moment, his head cocked, listening. Then, slowly, he drove the pickaxe in again. The same dense, muffled sound. He dropped the tool and fell to his knees, his hands digging frantically into the loose rock and mud at the bottom of the pit. He worked with a feverish intensity, pulling away handfuls of wet earth. Alara found herself moving forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood at the edge of the pit, looking down. His hands were caked in mud. He grunted with effort, pulling at something lodged deep in the clay. Came free with a sucking sound. He sat back on his heels, breathing heavily, and slowly opened his hands. Lying in his palm, nestled in the dark mud, were several rough, oddly shaped stones. They were not the gray, lifeless rocks of the creek bed. Even caked in dirt, they held a deep, internal light. One of them had a fractured edge, and from it gleamed a color she had only ever seen in the deepest twilight sky. A profound, velvety blue. Sapphires. He had not been digging for water or gold. He had been chasing a memory, a story perhaps, of a geological anomaly, a forgotten alluvial deposit. He had gambled everything on a whisper of a chance, and the unforgiving land had finally answered. The sound of carriage wheels and horses' hooves announced their arrival long before they came into view. Mr. Davies had returned, and this time he was not alone. The county sheriff, a portly man with a weary expression, rode beside him. This was it, the final act. Alara stood on the porch, her hands clasped before her, a strange calm settling over her. She had already lost everything. There was nothing left for them to take from her spirit. Davies dismounted with an air of grim satisfaction. The sheriff remained on his horse, his gaze sympathetic but his posture resolute. He was here to do a job. Mrs. Blackwood, Davies began, forgoing any pretense of courtesy. The deadline has passed. The property now belongs to the bank. The sheriff is here to ensure a peaceful transition. He produced the official papers, waving them like a banner of victory. Alara did not look at them. Her eyes were on the path from the creek. At that moment Silas appeared. He was covered in mud from head to toe, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, his clothes torn. He looked like a man who had wrestled with the earth itself and barely won. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his exhaustion evident, but his shoulders were square. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his expression unreadable, and looked from the banker to the sheriff and finally to her. Davies scoffed. "And what is this? Your madman come to protest?" Silas said nothing. He simply mounted the steps and stood beside Alara, a silent, solid presence. He held his closed fist out in front of him. For a moment, everyone was still. The only sound was the jingle of a horse's harness and the ever-present wind. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he opened his hand. On his muddy palm rested a small pile of blue stones. They were unpolished, raw, and still clung with bits of clay, but in the harsh afternoon light, they glowed with a cold, deep fire. He turned and placed them carefully on the worn railing of the porch. A king's ransom in the rough. Mr. Davies stared at the stones on the railing. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The confident, condescending mask he always wore had shattered, replaced by sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He took a hesitant step forward, peering at the sapphires as if they were a mirage that might vanish. He reached out a trembling finger, then seemed to think better of it, snatching his hand back. The sheriff shifted in his saddle, his eyes wide. He looked from the raw, magnificent gems to the mud-caked man who had produced them, then to Alara, whose face remained a calm, unreadable mask. The entire dynamic of the confrontation had shifted in an instant. The power, which moments before had rested entirely with the banker and his legal papers, now lay in a small, dirty pile on a wooden rail. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Davies finally found his voice, though it was a strained, thin version of his usual tone. What is this? Some kind of trick?" Silas did not deign to answer him. His gaze was fixed on Alara. His eyes, dark and intense, held a question. He had unearthed the treasure, but he had done so on land that was, for this single, fleeting moment, still hers. The choice belonged to her. In that look, Alara saw everything. His gamble, his unwavering faith in a piece of worthless ground, his silent struggle. He was offering her not just the stones, but a future. The fear that had been her constant companion for months simply evaporated, burned away by a sudden, fierce surge of strength. She was no longer the grieving widow, the helpless victim. She was the owner of this land and everything in it. She straightened her shoulders and met the banker's incredulous stare. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, carrying across the yard with an authority that stunned both men into silence. "This is my land, Mr. Davies," she said, "and you are trespassing." Months passed. The wind still blew across the plains, but it no longer sounded like a lament. It carried the scent of damp earth and new growth. The foreclosure notice was a forgotten relic, paid in full with a single stone. The remainder of the fine secured in a bank vault under the name Blackwood and Silas. The name was Alara's idea. Partnership. The money had been a tool, not a solution in itself. It had allowed them to drill a new, deeper well, one that tapped into the sweet water Thomas had always believed was there. It allowed for the purchase of new stock, their healthy coats shining in the sun. The land, given water and a second chance, was slowly returning to life. Patches of green spread from the irrigation ditches, a stubborn, miraculous blush against the brown earth. Silas was no longer the hired hand. He worked alongside Alara, his silence now one of comfortable companionship rather than solitary grief. He had his own piece of ground, but he chose to work this one, to pour his knowledge and strength into its revival. The pit in Misfortune's run had been filled in, the earth smoothed over. It had given up its secret, and now it was allowed to rest. The true wealth it had provided was not the stones themselves, but the resilience they had forced from the people who worked it. One evening, they stood on the porch together, watching the sun set. It was the same sun, the same sky, but it no longer felt merciless. The colors were rich and deep, a promise for the coming day. The silence between them was easy, a language of its own. Alara was no longer a ghost in her own home. The house was filled with the quiet sounds of life, the ticking of a clock, the low hum of conversation, the plans for the next season. She had faced the bottom of the world and had not been broken. She had been forged anew in the dust and the mud, her strength discovered in the act of fighting for something, of trusting someone. The land had not made them rich overnight. It had given them the means to earn their future, a future they would build together. And as darkness settled over the recovering fields, a quiet, steady hope burned brighter than any gemstone.